On this episode of the Philosophy Society podcast, I talk to Angel Lua. We discuss hedonism, multiculturalism, neuroplasticity, goal setting, and their effects on mental and social health. These are issues that are prominent in our society, and it is crucial we begin understanding what they are and what we can do about them. We've talked about hedonism in the past, and we're going to define that as like living for, how should we define hedonism? Like living for the weekend, engaging in sort of like sensual activities, alcohol, partying, that sort of thing. We've also talked about clashing of different cultures within a single space, i.e. within Australia, we've got, such a huge diversity of cultures. We're a multicultural nation. And you've obviously got, you're studying philosophy, but you're also studying neuroscience, which means you have a grasp on, and I know it's a very complex topic, but you would have a better grasp on things like neuroplasticity, neural pathways, how the brain works than what I would have. And what I'm interested to hear from you is how those sorts of three different things that you are interested in and consider kind of like join and combine.
Okay, so I'm going to do what a lot of my philosophy teachers have taught me to do, and is to put it into premises. That's Good. What I'm going to do. So the first thing I'm going to say is, yes, Australian culture prizes materialism and capitalism. Yes, we do have that drive for living for the weekend, but it's not necessarily a generalization, because like what I've said, there are people who come from different cultures in Australia, but there are also people over here who want to live for the weekend. And the last podcast when we talked about, which didn't work out, was there are people who are not really satisfied with their job, and there are people who really love their job and they really want to release their stress into something. And this is the problem because of our large diversity in Australia, there are a lot of people who subscribe to different ways of living. And one thing we can find is that there are certain ways of living that can be detrimental to some people. And we've seen this in, a lot of news and a lot of articles, is when people do things to an excess. For example, we hear stories about, drug overdoses, people sadly passing away due to, regretful decisions in their life. And one thing I'm really interested in looking at is, when I hopefully do my honors, is making a connection between the schools of phenomenology and neuropsychopharmacology. So phenomenology, as we both know, is the philosophical school of the study of intentionality and consciousness as well. And neuropsychopharmacology is, the effects of medication and the study of mind. And the interesting thing about both of those fields is they pinpoint the area of consciousness. Now, consciousness is a very complex topic. And one thing I'm really interested in looking at is what makes people vulnerable to making risk-taking behaviors. Because while everyone is different, there's some group of people who choose to do things that are not ideal, which can hurt themselves and hurt others as well. And while the answers may be easy, such as, they didn't make the right choices, or they didn't have a good family. And, we hear stories, crazy stories. And do you follow Vice, like Vice News?
No.
Okay. But you see a lot of stories about children and adults, who live their life suppressing emotions. And when somebody suppresses their emotions a lot, they just flip one day. They just switch. And these impulsive decisions can really make a detrimental effect to the community.
So just a very quick question, is your general area of just concern what leads people to end up in life situations that are less than ideal, that are bad? Is that your general concern, and then there's different reasons that you have that might be contributing to that?
I think it comes a lot from my background. and we've discussed it earlier, but to say it again, my family was really conservative. And when I came to Australia, because I moved here when I was 13, there was definitely a contrast of cultures I was exposed to. I came from the Philippines, and Philippines was very conservative. Religion was a big part in the Philippines. And then when I moved to Australia, religion is not as big of a thing. And in fact, there's a wide range of religions present in Australia, where in the Philippines, it was just Roman Catholicism. And when I moved to Australia for the first time, I was shocked by some of the things which happened. You know, for example, I remember when I was year 8, there was this guy who just told the teacher to shut up. If that happened in the Philippines, that kid would really get in trouble. I wouldn't say what they would do in the Philippines, but you get the point. So, going back to what I was saying, why I'm really interested to do this type of research is because it comes from what I've been through as well. And my first and second year wasn't ideal. I definitely did things I really regret. And there was a time where my mental health just, plummeted. It wasn't a good part of my life. And one thing I've been trying to do is trying to be a better person. But the thing is, it's hard to be a better person when you've already been through a lot of stuff.
So, when you start looking at psychoanalytic thinking, I'm talking like Freud and all Freud and all those lads, Carl Jung. There's a general idea there that what makes up a person, what makes a person's personality, can be essentially broken down into different components, right? So Freud, for example, had the id and the ego and the superego and all those sorts of things. And I don't even really know what they all stand for, but the general idea was what you need to do is incorporate them into a whole. And that's what a healthy person does, incorporates the sub-personalities into a joint, unified personality. What I'm kind of hearing from you now is kind of that on like a societal scale, right? So you've come from a conservative background, a religious background. You came into a different country which was not as conservative and not as religious, and you've had differing influences in your life, whether that's from family or from school or from university. And if you don't incorporate all those things into some sort of unified whole, right, you're going to run into trouble, whether that be mental and social health or some other sort of aspects of your life. Would you agree with that sort of picture?
I would agree with that.
So
I would agree with that.
I think the question then becomes, and I think that's a really, really sophisticated view to have, and it's really, really interesting to consider things in that particular way and draw that analogy. I think the question that naturally arises out of that, and I don't know whether you have or haven't thought about this, and if you haven't, we won't need to discuss it, but it's, given that view of things, how can we help people from different cultures and people that are almost caught in the middle of like different pulls and different pushes in their lives? How can we help them incorporate all those pressures into a unified whole so that they can live healthy, productive, happy lives?
That is such a good question, because that's what I've been trying to find out as well.
What's your like preliminary thoughts then? Like obviously it's like the same with everything, right? We never like flesh out the whole answer, but what's your like initial thoughts about that question?
I can say one statement, and I can say that communication is really important, because I'm actually going to talk about an experience which happened to our family when we first came to Australia. And this is actually very well prevalent to what's happening right now with xenophobia towards the Asian race. When we first came into Australia, my dad was renting an apartment, and it was under a person who, was really friendly the first time we've seen him. So with some context, I'm just going to give you some context. We came to Perth 2 times. The first time was when we were scouting things out and we're just trying to see if this was the right place for us to move into. And we rented an apartment from the same person. And this person was really pleasant. He was really delightful. But when we came back 2 years later, my dad complained that it was, really cold because, we came from a tropical country. And long story short, there was just this miscommunication because the cleaner in the room said that the room was really stuffy. My dad made a complaint and said, my kids feel really cold. And the person said to my dad, if you don't like it here, then you should just go back to your country. And I still think about that sometimes. And actually, I was talking to my dad about it last week. And as much as I was mad, as much as I wanted to do crazy things like go back to the apartment and say, this is what happened to us 4 years ago, I also had to realize that maybe there was a situation where he encountered an undelightful experience from someone.
There's I think a big problem is kind of the incommensurability of people's experience.
Exactly.
Right? So I've obviously had a different life growing up than what you had, right? And you had a different life growing up to what that guy next door has, and et cetera, and even though I can make my best attempts to sympathise with what other people are going through, and even though I've made my best attempts, and I can make my best attempts to empathise with what people are going through, there's always going to be a difference in that I've had an experience and you haven't, or you've had an experience and I haven't. And it's all sometimes it just seems like there's no way to kind of overcome that incommensurability. And that's obviously a really, really difficult thing to deal with, right?
That's what makes things difficult in life right now, because communication is not easy. And in a perfect world, if we could communicate in all the same language, everything would be ideal. But the thing is, everyone is different. Everyone has different ways of how to live life and how we cope with things. And when there is a clash, whether it be culture or how we see things, conflict can happen. And I'm the biggest hypocrite in saying this when I say we should avoid conflict, because my friends would know me and they would say, Angel puts herself in situations and stuff. And I've definitely been in positions where I could have avoided the conflict if I just kept my mouth shut. But then we also live...
But it's not entirely obvious that that's the right thing to do, right?
Yeah.
I don't think we should go through life avoiding conflict. Right? Sometimes conflict has to be had. I think there's a proper way to have to conflict with someone else, to disagree with someone else. If I disagree with you right now, I'm not just going to keep my mouth shut. I'm going to let you know, right? And I need to let you know because then we can figure out what the problem is and then we can live better lives into the future. Right? So don't ever keep your mouth shut. But it's about how you approach the situation.
Yeah, that's really true, because there were definitely times in my life where I should have done things in a professional manner. And I know I'm 21 and I know I'm young and I don't want to say I'm young, I'm able to do this stuff, because there were definitely consequences which had to be made. And one thing I find is when somebody goes through a difficult period in their life and when they're trying to sort their life out, problems follow. Problems definitely follow. And I was talking to my mom and I was saying, imagine if I moved into a different country, different state. And then my mom told me, but your problems will follow at the end of the day. And if you don't change the way you live your life, then the same consequences will happen.
Yeah, I think there's a great hope and a great message to be had for taking responsibility for your own problems, right? So, Buddhist culture and karma, I think, understands this quite well. When there's a problem, right, maybe you can get upset at the world, but also you can often lay the problems at your own feet, and you need to ask yourselves, what have I done wrong to cause this particular problem? But that also, I think, needs to stop at a certain line where some people just face life situations which are just so horrible and are so completely out of their control that they just need to be like, good job, world, like, you got me this time, and I'll get back on my feet and keep going again. Now, returning to what we were saying before, we kind of compared mental health to incorporating not just the internal aspects of a person's personality, but also the external aspects of their social lives in some sort of sophisticated way. And we've kind of talked about communication as being a tool necessary to achieve that particular end. And obviously there's difficulties with me understanding your experience and you understanding my experience. But how can I go about communicating with even someone like yourself that's obviously, you're a woman that was born in a different country, right? And we probably have very different views on a huge array of topics. How can we communicate in a way that allows us to overcome those differences so that we don't live in this sort of conflicted society and conflicted within ourselves? How do we improve this communication?
Respect, definitely. And I'm not saying respect as in a way of saying respect, dude, but respect is very integral to it. And this is the problem because there are some cultures which, my dad is Chinese and he's actually Chinese Bisaya. So Bisaya in the Philippines is an area in the Visayas. And Visayas we use a lot of plosive tones in our vocabulary, and I think the English students listening to this would understand. But in some cultures, it may sound rude to one culture, but that's just the way they talk. And that's why there can be a disconnection of how we interpret different ideas with other people, because some people may say that person is being rude. But then when we look at their culture and we think that that's just the way they talk. But this is when it gets difficult, right, Tim? And this is where it gets so difficult, because when you look at some cultures, everyone wants to be respected. And there's definitely a line where things can go out of hand. And this is when we see murders happening. This is when we see, really damaging things in our society. But one thing I really think is important is making sure that, it's so hard to say, but making sure that people do not stay in the detrimental state they are. And it's difficult to say that because, we look at the homelessness pandemic, and that's the real pandemic in Australia. Because we look at poverty in America, and we look at, the whole thing which is happening in Brazil with the COVID thing. And it's really easy for us in a really good country to say, this is how we solve everything, this is how we do this is how we do that. But when we look at different cultures where corruption is involved, and when an imbalance of power is put, that's when things can get difficult. There's actually a saying, there's a saying in the Philippines where you can put a saint into politics and they will turn into a devil. And
I reckon, I think that sometimes, I mean, even in a country that is nowhere near as corrupt, well, I don't know the political system over there, but I think politics everywhere, whether that's in Australia or whether that's on university campus culture or whether that's within an extended family, politics turns people into little shits. That's my version of your statement.
That is so true, Tim. I totally understand because, I've met people, who started off doing these degrees, and I've seen this happen in university. I've seen the most happiest people going to university and saying, I want to make a change. This is the reason why I want to do uni. I want to change the whole world. But after 3 to 5 years of their degree, the stress gets into them. And I'm one of those people, I didn't handle uni very well in my first and second year. And
people lose their purpose, right?
They do.
They lose track of what they're aiming for. And it's really, like, you can't move without aiming for something, right? That's, like, I think this is one of the reasons that people are so obsessed with sport, right? So, like, when you go and watch a soccer game, or when you go and play a soccer game, when you really think about what's going on, it's like, if you were an alien, you'd be like, what the fuck is this, right? Because there's, like, 100,000 people gathered around in this little, like, building thing, watching 20 little people run around on a ground trying to kick a ball into this net. And if someone kicks the ball, like, right into the corner of the net, everyone just goes berserk. Right? Like, why? Like, you literally kicked a ball into a net. Right? I think sport models what we have to do. Right? We need something to aim at. And we need to remember what we're aiming at. Otherwise, we're never going to get there. Right? If you just kick the ball randomly anywhere on the soccer field, the chance that it goes into the net is pretty low.
I think it's going to be impossible for it to go to the net.
Right? So when people enter into university with a particular purpose, or navigating through their lives with particular purposes, it's important that those purposes are continually reiterated. And I think that's something that's, like, done really well in, say, like a Catholic church culture, which I have been relatively exposed to in my lifetime. Right? They provide a purpose, whether you agree with it or not, and they certainly give people meaning, and they certainly reinforce that meaning and that purpose in people's lives. I guess then, if someone was in more of a, say, like, let's take a secular context, like a university, you enter into university like, I want to do politics, and I want to go into politics so I can make real consistent change. And then you go to university and people start being political with you, and people start, I don't know what politicians get up to, but it's not always just changing the world for the better. How do we stay on track, man? That's a question that I always ask.
Yeah, and that's what makes things difficult, because we do have our selfish desires. We do want the best for ourselves. And I can also look at my life and realize that there were times where I had to do what I had to do, and it wasn't the right decision, and I did hurt people. And while it's very idealistic to say that I'm going to change, I'm going to be a better person tomorrow, I'm going to wake up, I'm not going to make a mistake, I'm not going to swear at my mom ever again, and that's when it can get difficult, because I don't want to say no one's perfect, because then that would, like...
Well, but we are, like, we need to remember that we are human, right?
Yeah,
and
that's true.
So, like, I think one of the big issues sometimes is setting a goal that's, like, it's too far in front of you at this particular stage. So we need to take, like, goals need to be to improve on what you are, right? But you don't need to be a hero straight away, right? So if you're going out onto a soccer field, right, maybe you want to kick the ball into the net, but you don't need to do it with a bicycle kick the first time you kick the ball into the net, right? You need to build up to what you're aiming at. And if you went out onto a soccer field with the goal straight away to kick the ball into the net via a bicycle kick, you're not going to kick the ball into the net in the first place, right? So we need to build up gradually, right? And I think in life, if you have aims and you have goals, it has to be one little baby step at a time. If you ever want to get anywhere, yeah.
That's a really motivational thing to hear. That it's really true, because I remember when I was in year 12 and I had this goal of getting into med, doing really well in my ATAR. Long story short, I didn't get the ATAR I wanted, definitely not, but where I am right now, I wouldn't trade it for anything else. Because while I did get into trouble, and while I'm not where I want to be, I'm content where I want to be. And being content in life is often an issue for a lot of people, because when is enough really? Yeah.
It's a good question.
When is enough? Because I remember having a conversation with my year 12 teacher when I was year 12. And she told me a story of how she went to uni with somebody who ended up being in a really high position in some health department. And she told me on how her friend did everything in high school, did everything, and, you know, when she finally got it, she realized, what do I do now? Because I've seen my family and I've seen my friends, you know, finally achieve the things they want. And it may seem that they are content, and definitely they can be content, but we never really know if they are really truly content in their heads.
I think that's a really big issue just in general with the human condition, right? Like, we get used to whatever we've achieved, and we get used to what we've got, and if your satisfaction and your purpose and your happiness comes from getting more, right, like, that's going to be a perpetual stream until eventually you max out and there's not going to be any more that you can get. And I like, one of the really, really interesting things that I've discovered was that there is a zero correlation between subjective life satisfaction, so just asking people how happy are you with life, and income over $70,000 a year in Australia. So once an Australian's earning over $70,000 a year, you can't guess their subjective quality of life based on their income. Right? The person that's earning $71,000 is just as likely to be happy as the person earning $1 million. Right? So it comes into, you know, this comes into the idea of hedonism, right? Like, what are you chasing and what are you valuing, and is that really the right thing to be valuing? Help me, Angel. What do I do?
I wish I could say that balance would solve everything, because I look at the way my friends live their lives and how I used to live my life. And while balance is a very good answer to say, you know, my mom told me, when you go to work, you do your work. When you go to uni, you go to uni. When you're with your friends, you know, you do friendly stuff. When you're with your boyfriend, you do things with your boyfriend. But the thing is, when you form a relationship with someone or your studies, like, for example, when I'm studying for a lecture, there's always going to be things creeping up in our head, whether that be a conversation we had for a friend, or whether that be the thing we're thinking about of what we have to do the next day, like filling up our car with fuel. And categorizing things into small boxes is what makes things difficult. Because while balance is an ideal way of living life, it isn't necessarily the easiest way to live. Does that help you a little bit?
It gives me lots to think about.
Yeah, it gives me lots to think about as well. Because I'm not perfect, and I hate saying I'm not perfect because, you know, obviously when you hear people say they're not perfect, some people would think that, oh, it's just an excuse for the way they live. And I have to be careful in saying this because I've definitely wasn't the best person.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously there's different levels, but I don't think anyone can look on their lives and be like, yeah, I was really good at all stages. And there's definitely things that we all should be like, man, I was a bit of a dick there. Like, I did the wrong thing there or something like that. I guess what I'm interested in calling on now is we've talked about mental health, we've talked about the conflict between different cultures and communication and respect and what we can do about that. You're studying philosophy and neuroscience. What I'm interested in hearing from you is where the neuroscience comes into this particular issue.
Okay.
Like, why study neuroscience?
So when I first came into neuroscience, the one thing which really interested me was it's a very holistic way of looking at the body and how everything works out. Because when you study neuroscience, you start realizing that when you progress into higher units, pharmacology is involved, physiology is involved, anatomy is involved, and even to extent philosophy is involved. The third year unit I'm doing right now, neuropsychopharmacology, they make a lot of references to philosophical studies such as phenomenology, and that's something I'm really interested in. And one thing I'm really interested at is combining, science and arts together. But that's when it can get difficult, because science is a very practical, rigorous way of doing this, where arts can be a lot of fluid. And going back to your question with neuroscience, one thing I'm really interested in is the idea of neuroplasticity. And this is a very complex topic, bear with me, but it's something I've been thinking about for a while, ever since I was in year 12. But I'm not an expert when I say this because I don't have a proper degree yet, but the rough idea with neuroplasticity is when you develop an area in your brain, a lot of times, you start to strengthen those circuits. And when you don't do other things, those connections don't really work out. So remember what I said about coming from a conservative family and, doing into a culture shock? When I first came into Australia, all those, pathways in my brain, they had to expand right away. And that's when things such as sensory overload can happen. And that's when, people can snap. And yes, there were times where I didn't make the right decisions. And yes, there were times where it was difficult for me to, understand other people.
This is what I think I heard from you just now. So here we are, we live with lots of different cultural pressures on us. If we can't incorporate those in the appropriate way, there's going to be negative consequences, whether that be on our social actions, whether that be on our mental health, or whether that be in some other particular way. Now, when we are exposed to these differing cultures, to these differing pressures, to these pulls and these forces, it actually affects the way that your brain works, and it changes your brain. Is that what you're saying? So, like, being exposed to, like, strongly conservative backgrounds and then switching to, I don't know, maybe a hedonistic background or some other sort of background actually changes the way that your brain, in some relevant sense, changes the way that your brain is, like, put together?
Yes, to some extent, but it's not only dependent on culture as well, because there are a lot of factors which can cause the brain to change. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but there's something called epigenetics, and it's a new field in neuroscience where, things in the past can affect the way your descendants can act. And it's a very new field. And that's the problem about research these days, because it's difficult to find new things out, right?
And also complex.
Yeah.
And there's lots of factors interacting to produce a single thing. So.
Yeah, that's true. And that's why when I hear about complex ideas, that's why I try to run away. But then I also think about that this is what I have to study. And these are the things that I really want to work out. But...
So I've got one more question that I really, really want to ask you. How is neuroscience, how is the study of the brain and how the brain changes and how the brain functions, how is that going to help people?
My main goal is actually to reduce the stigma with mental illnesses. I grew up in a family where mental illness was not necessarily a thing to look upon. And mental illness could be constructed as disobedience, rebellion. And one of my family members who is afflicted with schizophrenia, I remember when my mates thought he was crazy, when my friends thought he was out of this world and he shouldn't be, a contributing member to society. But when I learned more about neuroscience and when I understand that the imbalances of hormones can be involved, and also when we look at the factors which can lead to an intensification of a certain mental condition, we start to realize that neuroscience isn't an easy subject. And philosophy is not an easy subject, because I always remember that the more I know, the less I know at the end of the day. And that's why I feel so bad when I do something stupid, because I realize, why did I do that?
So with neuroscience, with philosophy, we can learn more about why people do what they do, why different cultures value what they value, why particular issues exist where they exist. And through that understanding, we can decrease stigma, we can increase sympathy, we can increase empathy, and I bloody wish you all the best in addressing those issues at the same time.
Yeah, because it's difficult, because here's the thing, Tim. It's so idealistic to say that my papers in the future, if I do publish those papers, will change the world.
Yeah, but you don't need to change the world. You just need to contribute what you can contribute.
That's true.
If you die, and you will eventually die, but
yeah, obviously.
when you die, if you can say, I did what I could to help people, and regardless of whether that means you helped 1 or 0 or 100,000 people, I think you can rest in peace pretty happily. But don't die anytime soon.
For legal reasons, that was a joke.
Thank you for coming on the podcast. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, it was intense at the beginning, but we got there at the end.